Hi, I'm Travis and you're watching Curious Tangents. And in the 1980s, the US began one of its most ambitious and strangest science experiments. A huge dome was constructed in the middle of the Arizona desert. The dome had its own water and oxygen cycle. It housed trees, bees, fruits, vegetables, and eventually 8 people would walk inside of it and be locked in there for 2 years. Biosphere 2 did not efficiently produce and store oxygen, which is a very important thing if you would like to keep the human beings, living. And to make this already incredibly strange experiment just a little bit stranger, it was taken over by local Sith Lord Steve Bannon. This was probably a stressful situation for everyone inside. However, what I'm really interested in are the trees. See, the trees grew much faster than what you would expect to see in nature, and it was probably because the trees were in the ideal situation to be a tree. They had fertile soil, pollination, water, and sunlight. And yet, once they reached maturity, they just toppled over. This is a video primarily on stress and not Biosphere 2, but see if you can figure out why the trees just toppled over before I tell you at the end of the video. The word stress gets thrown around a lot, and typically not in a good way. However, we also use stress to mean a ridiculous amount of different things. For instance, if I'm working out, then I'm putting stress on my body. In fact, I'm even damaging it. However, when I go to sleep, assuming that I've eaten right, my body will then repair the muscle cells. Through a process known as hypertrophy, when you damage the muscle fibers by working out, your body then fuses them together and repairs them, and then you come back stronger than you were before. And that's how muscle growth works. The bones in your body undergo a very similar process. If I were to clone you, and then send you into space and then keep your clone here, you would lose a significant amount of bone density. We can be sure about this because NASA has done it. Not the cloning exactly, they used twins, which are pretty much the same thing. In 2015, NASA sent Scott Kelly into space, and they left his brother, Mark Kelly, with us. On average, an astronaut loses about 1% of their bone density per month. For comparison, an average person aged 65 and older loses that exact same amount over the course of a year. Because most of space has little to no gravity, bones have little to no reason to be strong. Stress on the body, even stress that pushes the body to the limit, albeit without breaking anything, makes us stronger. This kind of physical stress that can be good for the body is not what most people mean when they say that they're stressed out. Most of us know that these kinds of physical stress are good for us. What we mean is that we are emotionally or cognitively overwhelmed. Like when I say that I have to finish 168 different projects this year, it's me being cognitively overwhelmed. I think that most people think that the mind and body run on 2 completely separate systems and are thus strengthened in 2 different ways. At least that's what I thought a while ago. However, that doesn't seem to be the truth. It seems that you can strengthen your cognitive capacity or emotional resilience the same way that you can strengthen your bones and muscles. But back to stress. We would categorize my bone and muscle example as being the same thing. That's probably good. However, say my boss, who no longer exists, comes up and yells at me about something I've done. I would be stressed out, but it wouldn't make any sense to categorize that stress as the same kind of stress that made my bones and muscles grow. For stress that's positive, we'll refer to it as eustress, and for stress that's negative, we'll refer to it as distress. Now, initially I thought that things were either going to be innately beneficial, eustress, or innately detrimental, distress. This idea, like most of my initial ideas, didn't really hold up to research. Psychologist and stress researcher Kelly McGonigal has written some very interesting things. Most of us are very familiar with the fight or flight response. It's what we most closely associate with stress. It's also known as a threat response. However, there is a completely different way that your body can respond to stress. If you are being chased by a woolly mammoth, then your threat response is probably on. However, if you are chasing a woolly mammoth, then your challenge response is probably on. When an elite athlete is getting ready for their game and they're too excited to stand still, they're usually experiencing a challenge response. And if they choke, it's typically a threat response. While having too many threat responses or fight or flight situations does tend to break down the body, the challenge response does the exact opposite, improving things like heart rate, blood flow to the brain, and even your ability to learn. By far the most interesting thing about this is that for the most part, you get to decide what is a threat and what is a challenge. Researchers have actually done this quite a few times. They'll split people into two groups and then tell one group why their stress response is good for them, and then tell the other group why it's bad for them. And the groups who get the positive video on stress outperform those who get the negative video on stress, as judged by judges who didn't know which group was which. It seems like there are two things that really determine whether or not a person has a positive response or a negative one. And that's whether or not a person thinks that they have what it takes to deal with what's ahead of them. If they think they do, they have a challenge response, and if they think they don't, they have a threat response. The other thing is that people who think that stress is bad for them tend to stress about their stress, and stress about stress is always a threat response. It would seem that meaning plays a really big part here, as stress about stress is always meaningless. A common narrative around stress is that stress kills, and that's not completely untrue. Lots of distress does shorten the lifespan. However, if this were entirely the case, then you would expect to see parents, people who are doing the thing that is, for most people, the most stressful thing they will ever do in their entire lifetime, raising a child, to have shorter lifespans. What you actually find is the exact opposite correlation. People who are parents tend to live longer than people who are not. While raising a child is one of the most stressful things that the average person will do in their lifetime, it also ends up being one of the most meaningful, and people are dispositioned toward looking at meaningful stress as also useful or challenging stress. Quick note, the next section of this video is not me trying to somehow explain to you that trauma is a good thing. Please don't go out and traumatize yourselves and then say that Travis sent you. You would expect that with the amount of traumatic events that a person endures, their life expectancy would go down. The chart should look something like an inverse correlation. The more traumatic events, the lower the bar graph. In a 40-year-long study, researchers found that that chart was a lot more like a bell curve, and that people who had experienced a moderate amount of traumatic events were actually the happiest, moderate as defined as 4 to 7. Interestingly, people who had less than 4 events rated their life satisfaction as lower than people who had 7 on average. But again, don't go seeking trauma because I said that. Saying that stressful events deteriorate us is just not a complex enough view of what stress is. In the Biosphere 2 trees from the beginning of this video, the reason why they're not growing strong like you would expect is because there's no wind. See, there's a reaction that happens between trees and wind. First, it makes the root system deeper, and second, it causes a thing known as reaction wood, or sometimes called stress wood. Just like our bones need gravity to be strong, the trees need the wind to stand tall. The stress that ends up being most distressful to us is not necessarily rooted in stone. The stress that's distressing is the stress we deem meaningless. And the stress that ends up being eustress or good for us is the stress that we deem meaningful. I'm reminded of Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor, a psychologist, scientist, and prisoner at the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where he would document the horrors and meaningless suffering of World War II. I am also reminded of the movie Soul. Both involve men pursuing meaning in very different circumstances. However, they arrive at similar points. Spoiler alert, not for World War II, but for Soul, if you look for the meaning in life, you will probably never find it because it wasn't there. Meaning is a thing that you make. Or in the words of Exervia, meaning is a jumper that you knit for yourself. And thanks for watching. This video was heavily based on Kelly McGonigal's book, The Upside of Stress. I read about 70 books last year, and this one was one of my favorites. In terms of strategies to implement, it's probably #1. At least as far as nonfiction goes. Also, I have a Minecraft server, but you can only get to the Minecraft server by going through the Discord server, but you should join that. I'm there sometimes. Also, I'm working on a lot of new projects, which is why there's such a big gap between my videos right now. If you'd like to stay up to date on those, then you can join my email list. It's not exactly an email list, it's called Inbox Squad, and it's from Michael Ye at the Better Life Project. It's a startup and it's got a lot of other cool features. But if you don't want to miss anything and you'd like to stay up to date on everything, hit that link in the description, subscribe, and once again, thanks for watching.